This is what I think the true message of International Women's Day should be. I think it should be a message of women fighting back and taking on a sexist system. But as you probably all know, and we were discussing it a little bit before the meeting, International Women's Day isn't quite, the radical revolt that a lot of us in this room would want it to be. For a lot of companies especially, it's a day to, celebrate women, to give women flowers, to give women chocolates, book a spa day for your partner, for your wife, for your daughter. But this is all a real far cry. Not that I wouldn't say that women don't occasionally want some of those things, but I think that every day can be International Women's Day if that means giving women gifts. But I think that the idea of International Women's Day that is presented by the corporations, presented by the mainstream media, is a far cry from the true origins of International Women's Day, or as very importantly Celia said at the start of the meeting, International Working Women's Day, as it was known. This day was first and foremost proposed by socialist women. International Women's Day is viewed by businesses as a way of making money. That's purely what it is at the moment. When you go on the official page of International Women's Day, you'll see, a long list coming down of massive corporations. I think DHL is one of them, the construction, Scottish Widows Bank. All of these banks on their page a few years ago, and this is a good example. McDonald's was a sponsor of International Women's Day. A company that has seen, there's been brilliant strikes and actions, but against sexual assault being commonplace in the workplace at McDonald's. That workers say is completely ignored, completely not taken seriously by the company. So I want to argue that the mainstream and liberal idea of liberation, pushed forward by these companies that put just women, kind of celebrating women as the main thing about International Women's Day, it really offers us very, very, very little. And you can see this today with what International Women's Day has become. But when it was proposed in 1910 by socialist Clara Zetkin and other socialist women, it was something much, much more radical. Zetkin had been elected leader of the Women's Bureau and had one argument that socialists must campaign for the vote for working class men and women. Zetkin chose 8th of March because on that day in 1908, some 15,000 women workers in the needle trade in New York marched. They were demanding the vote, they were demanding better pay, and just, a life worth living and better conditions. And it was on this date as well, but in 1917, the events that sparked the Russian Revolution also unfolded. In 1917, women workers demanded bread and peace in a demonstration that began the February Revolution, leading to the overthrow of the dictator, the Tsar. And it was this kind of resistance, organised by working class women, importantly socialist women, is the kind of resistance is the kind of resistance that what we need in the here and now. Sorry, I don't know why that was so hard to get out. As women's rights have been continually pushed back, and women are used as pawns in conflict, and the state is always looking to take back our rights. I think this kind of resistance is sorely needed. I also think it's important we highlight there has been also a really quite scary outpouring of sexist ideas and rhetoric that have gone along in society, along with the far right, along with the state. You look at someone like Andrew Tate, which maybe we could talk about a little bit in the rest of the meeting, some of the bile that he comes out with that is really symptomatic of the kind of sexism and misogyny you see from podcasters and men online. I think it's also important to point out, and you have to look at the attacks on trans rights as part of this as well. Mainly focus on trans women. You look at the push to try and block young people from accessing puberty blockers, and you also see the step up of anti-trans rhetoric from the likes of the big one, J.K. Rowling. Recently these attacks have become, a real horrible, nasty fever pitch, especially when it comes to trans women using toilets of their gender and the vile debate about trans women and prisons. And I think there's really been an effort to say that fighting for trans rights will damage fighting for women's rights in some way, but we must argue against this. We think a joined fight for both is where we can be stronger. But I think there's some really important questions we have to ask about why is there an outpouring from some corners of society of this sexist rhetoric and also this transphobic rhetoric. And why are these ideas taking purchase? How do they take root? And why does capitalism impact women so harshly in so many ways? And why can women, most importantly, the big question is, why can women's liberation not be found within the current capitalist system? So I think just to kind of dial it back, the answers to these questions can be found in the ideology and makeup of the capitalist family and women's role within this family. Despite real changes for women, hard fought for by those that came before us, women are still often expected to take up a caring role in society. So that caring role might comprise of looking after children, looking after elderly relatives, and doing, of course, the majority of the cleaning, doing the majority of the cooking, doing the majority of the domestic labour. You can see clearly in, for example, adverts for cleaning products or for nappies, that it's women that these products are being aimed at. I don't know if anyone remembers that awful Tory coronavirus advert that showed pictures of only women doing the work in the home. And so the ideology that women predominantly take up these roles is still very strong, still very persistent. But the question is, why does it persist? And really the state has a real motive to keep this ideology strong. Because the state needs the family to keep it functioning. The family takes the responsibility of the state for doing sort of the caring that it could do. The family's purpose is to be a system of caring for workers and children of workers in order to keep the system running. The family as we know it rarely came into being because of the needs of the transition to capitalism. So the Industrial Revolution meant masses of people were forced into new industrialised cities from the countryside to work in factories. This meant that old family ties were kind of broken, and it seemed that among workers the family might actually just disappear. Men, women and children all worked in factories, mines and mills in just terrible, horrible, horrendous conditions. People were dying, kids were dying, men and women were dying very, very young. And this offered a bit of an issue for the capitalists. You're not going to get very much good work out of people that are dying, mostly at 35. And it led to a place of partial sanctuary to be set up, the family. But this wasn't inevitable, and it wasn't natural. It had to be pushed by the ruling class. And this included pushing family values. It also meant pushing reform that meant that there was material benefits to existing within a family. It became possible, or maybe not just possible, for a family to live on just a man's wage. Well, again, as I said, basically possible. As we all know, working women often have also had to supplement this wage with working outside of the home as well. So this all really set the scene for everything we see now. And the idea that women still take up this caring role in society really still persists. Women are paid less, generally, which makes sense. It pushes them to stop working or work less in order to look after kids. And actually also, as it's incredibly expensive to pay for childcare at the moment. Women are also socialised different. Look at the kind of toys that you were given when you were young. You were given babies or dolls. We see the caring role in the kind of roles that actually women do take up in their jobs now. So, the majority of nurses are women, of care workers are women, etc. And all incidentally, are also paid very little. This work, the caring, is seen as less in society. But I really want to argue that this idea that a caring role in society is less is not something that has always existed, nor has women's oppression as a whole. So in a time that Marx and Engels called primitive communism, people lived in egalitarian societies where there wasn't as much division. The idea that being a carer or a gatherer is less than being a hunter, it hasn't always existed. So in pre-class societies, women may have had different roles due to them needing to give birth or carry children on their backs, but these roles weren't considered less than that of a man. Women's roles like gathering were actually a lot more reliable in terms of food collection. But it was when we started to settle, to perform agriculture, to build villages, we were able, through advancements in tech and some environmental changes, to, for the first time, gather a surplus. And it was those that controlled that surplus who actually weren't often women because of the kind of roles women took on, aka actually not ploughing. They didn't have a real direct connection into how things were made and gathering this surplus. More and more women's roles in society came to be considered subordinate because they were not often in control of this surplus. Women in their sexuality were further subordinated by the need to pass this surplus down the family line. And this surplus is very important because it was the basis of class, the time when a small minority exploited the majority. And Engels called it the historic defeat of the female sex. So, class and women's oppression started at the same time. And the family as we know it, has really changed throughout history. And it certainly hasn't always looked like it does now, but it always has relied upon the oppression of women. So, learning about this, I know we did quite a lot of history back then, probably, tens of thousands of years of history. But I think it's really important we keep on repeating that history so we understand that women's oppression hasn't always existed and that we have a power to beat it. And I think this history also helps us cut through arguments that some people come up with. There were those who will say that the subordination of women is actually just kind of a matter of biology. Men act in oppressive ways because that's how they biologically are. That's how they're programmed. When I don't think this is true. Men are often stereotyped as being aggressive or violent or domineering, and that some people say that's just part of human nature. And I would really rail against these arguments. And of course, I think these arguments give very little room for discussion of trans and non-binary people and how they feel about their gender. It's also important to have these arguments to say that women's oppression, as I said before, hasn't always existed. People lived for thousands of years without class, where women's oppression did not exist. We actually live like this much longer than we've lived like this. As capitalism is a tiny, tiny blip in the history of human societies. So with this knowledge, we have the hope to fight for women's oppression. We're not trapped by biology or by human nature. And in the process of fighting for women's liberation, and of course, we can also fight for liberation for all as well. And I think just to kind of start to wrap up the meeting, I want to say that when we fight, when we struggle, women can cast off some of the ideas about themselves. Some of the ideas that women are subservient or they're submissive or they have to be quiet. And others around us can also, they can have their ideas challenged about women as well. Look to Iran, where the murder of Mahsa Amini in October of last year by the police really sparked a revolt, where the loudest cry was women, life, freedom. This revolt began with mostly young women railing against authoritarian dress codes, and really became a full-scale revolt against the government that encompassed men and women, and even grew in some places into strikes. You look at women still taking a leading role in the living, breathing revolution in Sudan. And really, if you look at almost every protest everywhere against the system, a real common denominator is that it is women right at the front. And we say that struggle, it can be an antidote to women's oppression. I'm sure the women in the room will know how grinding being a woman is. The sexism you experience on an almost day-to-day basis. But as a socialist, I would like to say that struggle can actually feel like a real antidote. And this is also a part of a good reason why the upturning class struggle, the strikes that we see, can be so exciting. On picket lines, we say as socialists that this can be a place where workers can start to shake off some of the prejudices they might have had, and they start to see that the real enemy, is not a woman worker or a black worker, but the boss, the one who is really exploiting them. But it's also important to say, when I say that none of this is automatic. Socialists must fight tooth and nail to argue that on picket lines, that we're not just fighting against paying conditions. Well, of course, that's very, very important. But we also have to take up issues of oppression. We have to take on sexism and racism and every other kind of oppression as well. And I think in the process of fighting, we can kind of catch a glimpse of a world where women's oppression doesn't have to exist. So to do my second concluding statement, so while the number of female multimillionaires surged by 31% last year, billions of women still live in poverty. There is no liberation without women's liberation. Some may say that socialists are class reductionists who put too much on class and just completely forget questions of oppression. But for us, we don't hold this as true. This is not how we want to fight this battle. We know that only by alleviating the material conditions that create women's oppression can we strive to build a better socialist society. But this is not an overnight process. It requires men and women and those who don't align with any gender to fight for a better world. So that's where I'll finish. Thanks.